On August 19, 1944, deep within the forest-shrouded confines of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, General Alfred Jodl stared at a series of intelligence reports that should have signaled the salvation of the German Reich. Yet, as he traced the rapid arc of George S. Patton's Third Army across the maps of France, he realized that the Americans had achieved a speed of advance that defied every known law of military science. The crisis facing the Allied High Command was not one of enemy resistance, but of their own staggering success, because the spearhead divisions under Patton's command had raced 400 miles in just 30 days, leaving the supply depots at the Normandy beaches far behind and stretching the logistical umbilical cord to a point of near total rupture. Jodl and the methodical minds of the Wehrmacht General Staff had done the mathematics with cold Prussian precision and concluded that the American advance was bound to be checked by the friction of its own weight, since no army in history had ever sustained such mechanical velocity without a constant, massive infusion of fuel and ammunition that the damaged French road network simply could not provide. An armored division consumed 150,000 gallons of fuel every single day when moving at full tilt, and with Patton commanding 12 such divisions spread across a 60-mile front, the requirement for 12,000 tons of daily supplies meant that the Americans were essentially trying to push a tidal wave of steel through a pinhole. The German strategy shifted toward a desperate patience, believing that the laws of physics would do what their panzers could not, as they predicted the Third Army would grind to a permanent halt at the Seine River, allowing the Wehrmacht time to regroup and establish defensive positions that could potentially hold through the coming winter. What the German leadership failed to grasp was that the American military was not merely a fighting force, but a massive industrial engine capable of unprecedented improvisation, a trait nurtured by General George C. Marshall, who had spent decades reinventing U.S. military doctrine to prioritize overwhelming volume and continuous flow over the conservative, methodical logistics of the European tradition. As the supply lines reached their breaking point in late August, the crisis demanded a solution so audacious that it would violate every established principle of military transport, leading to the birth of a continuous convoy system that would become the mechanical heartbeat of the Allied victory. The French infrastructure lay in ruins because the retreating Germans had meticulously destroyed bridges, rail lines, and switching yards, leaving the Allied logistics officers with a nightmare scenario where the railway transport could not keep pace with the tanks, and the scheduled convoys were backing up at the beaches in a chaotic mountain of crates and fuel drums. Colonel Charles Thrasher, commanding the Advanced Section Communication Zone, stood before a room of skeptical officers and proposed a radical re-architecting of the landscape by creating a massive one-way loop of highways that would bypass the traditional bottlenecks and turn the French countryside into a high-speed conveyor belt. This operation, which would eventually be christened the Red Ball Express, was designed to operate on a scale that shattered the expectations of General Heinrich von Luttwitz and other German commanders, who assumed that the American mechanical advantage would eventually become a disadvantage due to the sheer volume of parts and fuel required to keep the machines alive. The blueprint for this logistical miracle required two parallel one-way highways where loaded trucks would roar toward the front lines on one route while empty vehicles raced back toward the beaches on another, creating a perpetual motion machine that ignored blackout discipline and demanded 24-hour operations with headlights blazing through the French nights. To make this impossible vision a reality, the U.S. military turned to the men who had been marginalized by the very society they were fighting to protect, as approximately 75% of the 23,000 drivers assigned to the Red Ball Express were African-American soldiers serving in a strictly segregated army. These men, who were often denied entry into white facilities back home, were suddenly handed the keys to the most vital machinery of the war, tasked with driving 5-ton loads of high-octane fuel and explosive shells across a war-torn continent while operating under a schedule that demanded 20 hours of driving out of every 24. The technical requirements for the mission were staggering because the motor transport service needed at least 140 truck companies and nearly 6,000 vehicles operating at an impossible 90% availability rate to meet the minimum goal of 4,500 tons of supplies delivered daily. Within only 36 hours of the initial proposal, the system was operational, and on August 25, 1944, the first wave of GMC CCCKW trucks, affectionately known as the Deuce and a Half, began their thundering journey from the Normandy coast toward the hungry guns of Patton's Third Army. The mechanical backbone of this entire endeavor was the GMC Deuce and a Half, a 10-wheeled titan of industrial output that possessed a ruggedness capable of navigating the cratered ruins of French villages while carrying loads that exceeded its theoretical limits by nearly double. Engineers had designed the CCKW with a 6x6 drive system and a 75-horsepower engine specifically to handle the primitive conditions of global warfare. Yet even these machines were pushed beyond their design tolerances as they hammered across the uneven French cobblestones at speeds that caused suspension systems to shatter and tires to disintegrate under the sheer heat of friction. The drivers immediately developed a unique and aggressive culture of survival and efficiency, painting slogans like Patton's Blood Bank and Detroit to Berlin Express on their hoods, while establishing their own set of traffic rules that prioritize speed above all else, including the immediate abandonment of any vehicle that suffered a mechanical failure. In this high-stakes environment, any truck that could not be repaired within 15 minutes was ruthlessly pushed into a ditch and stripped for parts because the mathematics of the Red Ball Express had no room for sentiment or delay, only for the relentless forward momentum of the tonnage. As the convoys began to roll, the sound of thousands of engines created a low, unending vibration that could be felt for miles, a mechanical roar that served as a psychological weapon against the German scouts who watched from concealed positions and reported back to their headquarters that the Americans were moving with a reckless abundance they could not comprehend. General Edgar Feutinger of the 21st Panzer Division personally observed the glowing ribbon of headlights stretching 20 kilometers across the dark horizon and realized that the Wehrmacht was no longer just fighting an army, but an industrial giant that did not need to sleep. The sheer audacity of the Red Ball Express meant that the Allied air forces had to maintain a state of total air superiority to protect the exposed columns of trucks, with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs patrolling the routes continuously to ensure that any Luftwaffe pilot daring enough to attack would never return to their base. This umbrella of protection allowed the drivers to maintain an average speed of 35 miles per hour, which, while seemingly modest, was a blistering pace for heavily loaded military transport operating on narrow, damaged French roads during the height of a global conflict. General John C.H. Lee, the polarizing architect of the European theater's logistics, oversaw the expansion of the route with a religious zeal, ignoring the personal animosity he drew from other officers, to ensure that fuel dumps were positioned 50 miles ahead of the actual front lines so that the tanks would never have to wait for a single gallon. Lee understood that in modern industrial warfare, the victory belonged to the commander who could manage the most efficient transfer of weight over distance. And by late August, his system was delivering nearly 3 times the initial tonnage goals, reaching heights of over 12,000 tons in a single day. The German intelligence officers, who had predicted a total logistical collapse, began filing frantic reports that made no sense to the high command in Berlin because Patton's tanks were not stopping at the Seine, but were instead crashing through German positions with a replenished supply of ammunition and fuel that should have been physically impossible to deliver. This success was built on the backs of the drivers who used military-issued stimulants to stay awake and drank coffee by the gallon, pushing their bodies to the absolute edge of human endurance to maintain a rhythm that would continue for 82 consecutive days without a single pause. However, the operation faced a hidden crisis that nearly brought the entire machine to a grinding halt. Not due to a lack of fuel itself, but because of the humble 5-gallon gasoline container known as the jerry can. The Allied advance was consuming these steel vessels at such a rate that by late September, over 2 million empty cans were scattered across the French countryside, left behind by advancing units who prioritized speed over the recovery of empty containers. This resulted in a desperate logistical vacuum where fuel was available at the ports but lacked the containers necessary to transport it, forcing General Eisenhower to issue a theater-wide appeal for the return of empties, warning that the failure to recover these cans would result in the total immobilization of the frontline divisions. Each gear shifted by these drivers was a silent but powerful argument for their own citizenship and worth, as they navigated through exhaustion that would have hospitalized most men, proving that the American capacity for total mobilization was the one variable the German military science had failed to account for in their calculations of the war's duration. The Red Ball Express was becoming a weapon of attrition that the Wehrmacht had no defense against, as it essentially nullified the tactical brilliance of German defensive commanders by allowing the Americans to sustain offensive operations indefinitely through sheer, overwhelming volume. By the end of the first week of operation, the statistics were already legendary, with nearly 90,000 tons of supplies delivered, and each convoy covering a round-trip distance of 686 miles, a feat that surpassed every prediction made by the Allied planning staff and shattered the morale of the German defenders. The highways of France were being transformed into the arteries of a new kind of warfare, where the logistics determined the strategy and the humble truck driver became as essential to the breakthrough as the tank commander leading the charge. The relentless thundering of the Red Ball Express was more than just a logistical feat. It was a physical manifestation of a nation's industrial soul being poured to the shattered asphalt of Western Europe. As the first week of September dawned, the sheer scale of American mechanical consumption began to reveal the true magnitude of the challenge faced by the drivers. To maintain this speed, the Quartermaster Corps had to establish mobile kitchens and water purification units along the highways, ensuring that the drivers never had to stop for more than a few minutes to receive a hot meal or a fresh canteen, creating a society of nomads whose only home was the cab of their GMC. A single Sherman tank, the workhorse of Patton's armored divisions, was a mechanical beast that burned through half a gallon of fuel for every mile traveled on decent roads, a figure that plummeted even further when navigating the muddy, cross-country terrain of the French interior. When you multiplied this by the hundreds of tanks in an armored division, which required 1,000 tons of supplies daily to remain operational, the numbers became a dizzying spiral of necessity that the German High Command had deemed impossible to satisfy. General Siegfried Westphal, the Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, had assessed the situation with cold logic, concluding that the enemy's supply lines would eventually snap under the pressure of their own speed. The German confidence was not born of arrogance, but of a brutal, bloody history of logistical failure that they had experienced firsthand during their catastrophic campaigns in the East. They remembered how the Wehrmacht's advance into Russia had foundered not merely on Soviet steel, but on the inability to bridge the vast distances between their supply depots and the front lines. In the Russian theater, German trucks had disintegrated on primitive roads, and their logistics were still heavily dependent on horse-drawn wagons, which comprised 80% of their transport, creating a fatal disconnect between the speed of their panzers and the slow pace of their supplies. Furthermore, the differences in railway gauges between European and Soviet tracks had caused supplies to pile up hundreds of miles away from the units that desperately needed them, leaving entire divisions immobilized and waiting for fuel that would never arrive. The German General Staff, having learned these lessons in the frozen remains of their Eastern Front, watched Patton's advance with a sense of déjà vu, convinced that history was about to repeat itself for the Americans. They simply could not conceive of a military culture that prioritized the truck over the tank as the primary instrument of victory. The Germans had failed to account for the unique brand of American military leadership, specifically the long-term vision of General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff who had been obsessing over the mechanics of movement since the First World War. Marshall was not merely a strategist of battle, but a master of the miracle of movement, having orchestrated the transfer of over 600,000 men and 93,000 horses in just 14 days during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive of 1918. Marshall understood that modern war was a problem of industrial throughput, and he had spent the interwar years ensuring that American motorization was unmatched by any other power on earth. Marshall had fundamentally reinvented American doctrine at Fort Benning during the 1930s, emphasizing a philosophy of continuous flow, redundancy, and a willingness to accept massive waste if it meant maintaining the momentum of an offensive. He had spent years identifying and elevating junior officers who shared this industrial mindset, purging the deadwood from the General Officer Corps and replacing them with men like Eisenhower and Patton, who understood that war was won on the assembly line as much as the battlefield. He insisted that every American infantry division be fully motorized, a luxury that even the elite German panzer divisions often lacked, as they still relied on requisitioned civilian vehicles and animals for their tail-end logistics. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate execution of Marshall's doctrine, brought to life by the polarizing but effective General John C. Lee, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his organizational genius. Known as Jesus Christ himself by his detractors for his high-handed manner, Lee prioritized delivery of tonnage above all else, even moving his headquarters into the luxurious Hotel Majestic in Paris while combat troops were still digging foxholes in the mud. Despite the friction he caused, Lee possessed the iron will necessary to command a system that pushed men and machines to the point of collapse, famously stating that war was reality and everything else was merely theater. Under Lee's command, the Red Ball Express became a masterpiece of brutal efficiency, where fuel dumps were staged 50 miles ahead of the Army's actual position, and ammunition was waiting at crossroads before the combat commanders even realized they needed it. This proactive logistical planning allowed Patton's Third Army to cross the Seine on August 25th, the very day German calculations predicted they would be immobilized by lack of fuel. Lee's insistence on automatic supply, sending goods forward based on predicted consumption rather than waiting for requests, removed the administrative friction that usually slowed down advancing armies. The heartbeat of this operation remained the 23,000 drivers, 75% of whom were African-American soldiers, who performed their duties with a level of dedication that stood in stark contrast to the discrimination they faced within their own ranks. These men lived in a state of perpetual motion, operating under the ironclad rule of Laval, which dictated that the road must never stop for any reason. If a driver fell asleep at the wheel, his partner was expected to slap him awake or take the controls without bringing the vehicle to a halt, maintaining a cadence that felt more like a factory floor than a military operation. Mobile maintenance units were stationed every 50 miles along the Red Ball route, capable of performing engine swaps in a mere 45 minutes, using mobile cranes, a task that would have taken a German mechanic 2 full days to complete. If a truck broke down and could not be repaired within 15 minutes, it was stripped of its vital components like a carcass and pushed off the road to ensure the flow of supplies was not interrupted for even a second. This cannibalization of vehicles was a deliberate part of the strategy, ensuring that the strongest machines kept moving while the weak were sacrificed for the greater momentum. As the operation stretched into the freezing rain and snow of November, the drivers from Midwestern states like Wisconsin and Minnesota shared their winter survival secrets to keep the fleet moving. They would drain the oil from warm engines at night, heat it over open fires in the morning, and pour it back into the blocks to get the truck started in sub-zero temperatures. Batteries were wrapped in blankets and rotated through heated tents, while alcohol was mixed into the fuel to prevent the lines from freezing solid. The sheer physical grit required to drive an unheated open-cab truck through a European winter while carrying tons of explosives cannot be overstated. The cost of this relentless pace was astronomical, with the Red Ball Express wearing out 180,000 tires in just 82 days, leaving mountains of rubber in the ditches of France. The drivers themselves suffered under a regime of sleep deprivation and exhaustion that led to widespread use of stimulants and a casualty rate that rivaled many combat units. Yet the results were irrefutable. Patton's Third Army advanced 400 miles in 6 weeks, seizing bridgeheads at Verdun and liberating Reims while the Germans watched in stunned disbelief. They had realized too late that the Americans were not just fighting for territory, but were engineering a victory through sheer crushing volume. The strategic pivot finally came in November, when the liberation of the port of Antwerp and the restoration of the French rail network allowed the Red Ball Express to transition into more specialized logistics runs. Yet the precedent it set had already altered the trajectory of the conflict forever. By delivering over 412,000 tons of cargo, the system ensured that the Allied momentum never truly stalled, providing the sheer weight of metal necessary to shatter the Siegfried Line and push the war into the German heartland. The miracle of movement had succeeded where the German blitzkrieg had eventually failed, proving that sustainability was the true key to modern conquest. The operation proved that in the era of industrial warfare, victory belonged to the nation that could deliver the most supplies, the farthest, and the fastest. George S. Patton himself would write in his memoirs that the truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserved as much credit for the defeat of Germany as any rifleman or tank commander. These men, many of whom returned to a country that still denied them basic civil rights, had built the impossible machine that broke the back of the Wehrmacht and changed the face of military logistics forever. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics can be just as decisive as frontline combat. If you were a commander in 1944, would you have prioritized more tanks on the front or more trucks to supply them? Let us know your strategy in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.